John T. Edge, welcome to Biscuits and Jam.
Happy to be here, Sid.
Where am I reaching you right now?
I'm in my office on campus at the University of Mississippi.
Back home in Oxford. That must be nice. I know you've been on the road a good bit.
I have. I love the road, but I love home even more.
Yeah. Well, it's such an honor to have you here. And, I've known you for a really long time, but it's not easy to find a half hour to just sit down and talk, is it?
No. And to, not catch a conversation on the phone when you're driving between appointments or, to have time dedicated to look at another human and just talk to them is rare. So thanks for the chance.
Yeah. Well, it's great to see you. And I just got to say congrats on everything you've got going on. I mean, so many projects in the works. And, aside from your work with SFA, you're now hosting your 7th season of True South, which is incredible. What's been the most gratifying part of being on that show?
I mean, there are a bunch of different ways to answer that. I can say now that, in this last year, moving through the world, moving through the South, encountering people who watch the show and respond to it, who see their South in the show we make, and having that community cut across race, class, politics, everything. Like that just wows me and it humbles me and it makes me want to make more shows because something's happening here that I didn't expect to happen. I knew we'd make a good show, but the response from people who genuinely seem to see the South of their childhood and their South of their today in what we're making really makes me happy.
That's really cool that you're finding an audience, and I think the longevity of it allows you to kind of build that. I mean, are you walking into some places where they've seen the show? Some of the places that you're featuring.
Yeah, we were in Jasper, Alabama, a couple of weeks back filming, and we were outside Bayou Fresh Seafood, a great little sushi joint in a gas station there. I believe Southern Living's written about it, actually.
Probably.
This man came up to me. He said, "I really love your show." And I said, "Well, thank you." And he said, "Well, I brought some things I want to show you." We were making an episode about Alabama coal country. Jasper was once kind of the epicenter of the coal industry, one of the epicenters in the South. And this man, this really kind man, brought me his coal mining helmet, which he wore as an inspector, and he went into the mines. His nickname was Tattoo. He brought his coal mining helmet, and it was painted to look like an Alabama football helmet. He had 18 on the side, and that was the number he told me of Alabama championships. And he came because he heard we were filming and wanted to see the people who made the show and thank them. So instantly he was in the show, which was so great because he just lit up, man. So 4 cameramen began to swarm around this guy to document this man who watched our show with his football helmet riff on his miner's helmet from the mines, and our worlds converged. It was great.
That's great. I love hearing that. Well, listen, John T., we'll get back to the show in a minute. But,
sure.
First I want to ask you something that I have never really gotten to ask you about. And that's, a little bit about where you're from. You grew up in Clinton, Georgia, which isn't too far from Macon.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about the house that you grew up in.
It's an apt question. I'm working on a memoir right now, and it begins in the house where I grew up. Clinton, Georgia, 12 miles from Macon. People may know it as the home of Old Clinton Barbecue. As a boy, though, people knew our town as, a pre-Civil War town in Georgia. Clinton came about in the 18-teens, 1820s, when Georgia was a frontier town, when this was a frontier, after the Creek Indian land cessions and the like. I grew up in the home of a Confederate brigadier general. The historical marker out front told of his brave exploits. And only later did I come to realize that the Confederate brigadier general, who I thought was a hero, actually at his pinnacle of his career at Gettysburg, failed miserably and got a whole bunch of young men from North Carolina killed. So to ask me where I'm from is a complicated thing to do. And I'm now trying to write about that, about the inheritances of my childhood, the stories I was told as a boy, the narrative of the South I accepted as a boy, and then writing a new story that begins with my childhood and moves through my life.
Well, it seems very fitting to me that you would be born in a place that is freighted with so much history and so much complexity. I suppose, any place in the South is that way if you look deeply enough. But not everybody has a historical marker right outside their yard.
Yeah, that marker which my mother valued so much. My mother was in love with history and in love with the trappings of history and the provenance of our house and the idea that Iverson, General Alfred Iverson, was born there, the brigadier general. And I was too as a boy. I dug for mini balls in the side yard. I knew the names of all the Confederate generals and their horses too. To live in the South is to be aware of many histories, and that one carried me just so far. By the time I got to Atlanta in the 80s after college, I was beginning to learn new ways to think about the South, and that came from, in a lot of ways, the build-up to the Olympics kind of changed the way I saw the South, because I read books by Southerners and I read newspaper reports that were describing to me all these different sorts of Souths. Ones I didn't know, like the Gullah and Geechee South of South Carolina, or the Tarpon Springs, Florida, and the Greek sponge divers. And I began to travel. I began to get to know those Souths. And as I did, I realized that one story couldn't fit. I realized that there were a bunch of different ways to understand the place that made me. And I went in search of those stories. And that's kind of been my career since.
Tell me a little bit about how your parents influenced your view of the world. I know your dad worked for the Bureau of Prisons, I believe, and was a parole officer, if I'm not mistaken. And I was very sorry to see you lost your dad a couple of years ago.
Thank you, Sid.
Tell me about your dad's kind of influence on you.
Everybody says this about their father, I hope, or says a version of this, but the greatest influence of my life in so many ways. My father was born in Florida, in Crestview, Florida, but came up in South Carolina or in Columbia. By 13, he was fighting in the streets, and not long after that, arrested. He came up in a tough household. Instead of going off to jail, he went off into the Navy. He enrolled in the Navy at 17 and was serving by 18 in World War II. He served on landing ships that would have landed in Japan, and instead the dropping of the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima released him from that, and he came home. And in that moment, he made a change. He learned a kind of tolerance in the Navy. He talked about going to San Francisco and going to a gay bar and realizing, like, everybody here is kind of okay. In 1944. And that experience, he talked about it fairly often, but he talked about a lot of others. My father realized that had he not gone in the service, he would have ended up in, my father was in like juvenile correction sort of jail, but he would have ended up in jail. So his first job was within the Bureau of Prisons in Montgomery, Alabama. From there, he went to Atlanta, from there to Macon, and worked most of his career as a federal probation officer based out of Macon. He worked for Judge Boodle. He's pretty famous in the South. He's the guy who forced the desegregation of the University of Georgia. And my father worked out the rest of his career as a probation officer, working with people who were and offering them a chance at redemption, which is what my father got himself.
Wow, interesting. I mean, the fact that he, he's about to go to jail and then he ends up working for him, and really must have had a unique view of the world and the people coming in and out of there.
He did. The night he died, I played for him Johnny Cash at San Quentin.
Yeah.
He loved that album, and it reminded him of his past and of his work. And we listened to that album together as he passed.
Was he much of a cook?
He was a good cook. He was a kind of guy who'd roast a big haunch of prime rib. And my Aunt Ruth didn't like the fact that my father loved to cook that meat rare. And so when he served it to Ruth, he would turn down the light so she couldn't see that it was blood red. And she loved it when he did that. My father was the kind of guy who would cook a pot of grits, and then he loves smoked fish and tinned fish. And he would put little, dive bombs of oysters at the bottom of a pot of grits, and he would serve them that way to me with the idea that I would hunt for the oysters at the bottom. He was a really curious cook too. I can remember as a boy, we drive to Atlanta, and my father, the same curious kind of outlook on life that I talked about him in San Francisco, my father would drive Buford Highway and go to Asian grocery stores and bring things home. I remember him bringing home black chicken from a lowboy freezer. I remember him coming home with dried squid. He was a small town kid who was really curious about the world, and that showed up in the food he ate, and that showed up in his outlook.
Well, and it sounds like it showed up in some of your direction too, in a way.
Yeah.
Not everybody was making trips to Buford Highway
No.
back in the day. What about your mom? Tell me a little bit about your mom as a cook. I mean, when you think about the dishes that she would put on the table, what do you most often associate with her?
I associate her with okra. My mother grew up in South Carolina. Okra was the dish in our house. Fried okra, okra boiled with tomatoes, okra. I remember my mother showing me at the store, you take the little pods, not the big ones. The big ones are tough. My mother made great salmon croquettes, served them with grits. We couldn't get the good kind of grits we've got today from places like Anson Mills. They were those pasteboard Jim Dandy grits, but she was a country cook, and she made great vegetable soup too. She always wanted the butcher to crack the shin bones, or what I guess is the femurs, whatever, the bones with a lot of marrow inside. She wanted the marrow for vegetable soup, and she always floated our vegetable soup with whole black peppercorns. She was a good cook. She was a country cook. She wasn't as adventurous as my father, but both of them loved food and loved dining out especially.
John T., you wrote a beautiful piece about her a few years ago. It was called My Mother's Catfish Stew, and it won a James Beard Award. It was in the Oxford American, and it was really a remarkable piece of writing, and I think a very courageous one for you to write, because a lot of it was about her struggles with addiction and alcoholism, but it was also about some things that you share in common. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that for a second. Just what are some of the qualities that you share with your mom?
I mean, the power for me of writing that piece was to name the things that were difficult, and then celebrate the things that were beautiful, and to moving forward from that piece to really focus upon the things that were beautiful, and they were many. My mother was outrageous in the best sort of way. I remember her at a Little League, after a Little League baseball game. We were at the Shoney's in Macon. She was standing up next to the Rotary Seal. I can kind of see her, and she had on like a team mother hat for my Little League baseball team with the Jones County All-Stars. And we'd won a playoff game. And my mother handed everybody on my team a John F. Kennedy $50. And she paraphrased his inauguration speech saying, "Ask not what Little League baseball can do for you, but what you can do for Little League baseball." And you laugh, I laugh, but she wasn't laughing. Like, she meant to inspire.
And so were you kind of hiding under the table somewhere?
In equal measure. I was hiding under the table, but I was also wondering, like, I admired that boldness, and I wondered, like, have I got this within me? And some of that ended up not playing out so well for me in my early years. My attempts to kind of follow in her footsteps led me through a wild run in college. But on the other side of all that, I recognize the import of standing before people and saying something that gives meaning to a moment. And I learned that from my mother.
John T., I want to talk about some other influences on you. And there are so many. You've been at this for a very long time, and you've encountered all sorts of people. And there are a lot of people who have come the South looking for stories, for a long time. I mean, especially in the food world. And you've known a lot of them. I mean, I think of people like John Egerton and Edna Lewis and Bill Neal and Jessica Harris. But I'm wondering if there's one person who sort of stands out as a mentor to you when it came to kind of learning your craft as a storyteller.
One quick aside before I answer it. When I was living in Atlanta, I got to take cooking classes from Miss Lewis and Scott Peacock, which was just, and they were in a cooking school off an interstate off-ramp in Atlanta. It was just wild to think back on that. Because I do feel like I've had a chance to learn from so many people, Jessica Harris included, who was so good to me as we began the SFA. But the person who shaped my way of thinking about food as a kind of cultural product more than any was John Egerton of Nashville. He had two great books. He was a journalist by training and wrote two really important books. One was called Speak Now Against the Day, and it was about the generation before the civil rights movement in the South, people who tried to forge a better, more diverse, more equitable South in the years when that was really hard work. Still remains hard work. The other book was called Southern Food at Home, on the Road, and in History. And those three components were, explained in the book. But from John, reading those books, getting to know him, as the Southern Foodways Alliance began, I realized that the man who wrote those two books was teaching me that those two subjects, civil rights, a fight for equity in the South, good food and where it comes from, those two subjects had something to say to one another. And I learned that from John and so many other things.
As someone who has spent so much of his career, talking about recipes that are passed down from one generation to the next and the kind of connectivity there, I'm wondering about you and what you like to cook. Are there recipes that you've kind of inherited from your mom or your dad or a grandparent that you continue to make?
It's really interesting to think because when my wife and I married, we said we'd be a modern couple, and we would share cooking duties, and and we do to an extent, but it's still fallen that I'm the person who cooks the big hunk of meat like my father did, and my wife is the everyday cook who last night made this really great roasted chicken thighs with olives and fennel. I think it was fennel. She's the everyday cook who relishes that work because she's feeding her family, because she's feeding her husband. And now that our son has left our nest, has graduated from college, Blair still cooks for us like 3 nights a week at least. And it's crazy. So in answering your question, which I'll get to, the kitchen has become more of my wife's domain. But the things I take away from my father is, I mentioned before that, when I was growing up, we couldn't get good grits. Now we get access to these amazing grits, and I've got a freezer full of grits from Anson Mills. I cook grits in a little miniature, cheap crock pot. Like, I don't know, it's like that big. I don't even know what that is. Maybe it's a quart. To cook grits in that crock pot, you can cook coarse stone ground Anson Mills in like 20 minutes because it's like aging bourbon in a really tiny barrel. Everything happens fast. Yeah. And when I cook those grits, I think about my daddy, and I think about those meals he would cook for me with pasty grits with the oysters down at the bottom. I cook egg foo young too. I love egg foo young. My parents took me to this place called the House of Ing in Atlanta. It was like Peachtree and 10th. And when I was coming up, that was the epicenter of the hippie culture in Atlanta, right near Piedmont Park. My mother once bought me for show and tell when we had an anti-drug campaign at our school. My mother bought me a hash pipe at that. Can I say that on this podcast? Bought me a hash pipe.
It was for show and tell, right? Yeah, sure.
It was. I mean, it really was. She bought me a hash pipe right down the street from House of Ing. But at a House of Ing, we ate egg foo young, kind of the most Americanized Chinese dish you can imagine. It's in essence, it's a deep fried omelet, a wok fried omelet. And I still love it. I love the gravy that goes on it. I love the roasted bits of pork inside. I love cooking egg foo young. It ties back, not to our home, but to places my parents took me. And my parents, as much as being good home cooks, were also really good diners. They loved restaurants, and I certainly inherited that from them too.
Yeah, you sure did. Well, and it's Blair who makes your mom's catfish stew, right?
She does.
Or a version of it.
So one of the ways I made a decision to remember my mother at an earlier time when it was harder for me to conjure her forth, more fraught for me than it is now. Blair and I made a decision that we would remember her by way of the catfish stew that she cooked. We now cook it in remembrance of my mother. My mother cooked it in remembrance of her father, who had a fish camp on the Edisto River, set trot lines on the Edisto, and kept hogs out there. This was when her family was living in Orangeburg, and Jesse Clifton Evans, for whom our son is named, Jess is named, cooked catfish stew out at his fish camp. And my cousin Meredith found an old copy of that recipe written in my mother's very florid script and gave it to me and framed it and gave it to me. It still hangs on our kitchen wall. So Blair took up that spatula, as it were, spoon, and began cooking that stew. It's not something I cook. It's something she cooks in act of remembrance of my mother, whom she never got to know well. So that gesture, that kind of purposeful family connection that my wife makes to my mother is deeply appreciated.
Well, John T., this is going to sound a little weird, and this may be a conversation for another time, but, all of the Evanses on my side of the family are from Orangeburg.
Really?
So,
whoa!
So we may have to do a little digging on that one.
Do you know if you go back to Rowland Evans?
Yes.
Oh, then we're related. Yeah. Who? So you know the story that Rowland Evans and his brother, whatever his name was, Richard, came from Wales on a ship, and they were orphaned on the ship because their parents died.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we're related.
Yeah. And I tried to I wanted to go see his grave a few years ago. It was in 2020, but his grave is back deep in the woods
On private property.
on
Yeah.
private property. And I wasn't able to get the permission. And even if you did get the permission, I think you had to have some kind of like a real, a four-wheeler or something to get back in there. So, all right, well, this will
We
have
need
to
to go
be
together. No, we should. I want to do the same thing. We should go together.
All right, we're going to put that on the calendar. We have more to talk about.
Indeed.
Well, let's talk about True South.
Yeah.
You've really created something special here, and you're in season 7, as we said earlier.
Yep.
Briefly, I'm wondering if you can just tell me about the origin of this and kind of the original idea behind it. And I know you and Wright Thompson, who's executive producer, a good friend of yours, and your partner, a tremendous writer, cooked this up together. What was the essence of the original pitch?
We sat for lunch one day at Handy Andy, which is just off the square in Oxford, Mississippi. It's about 2 blocks from Wright's house and about 8 blocks from my house. We live very close to each other. And we went to Handy Andy with the idea of talking about something, a project we do together, perhaps a television show. And we got cheeseburgers and we got fries. And we talked about this idea, and this is a little egotistical, and I don't hope it doesn't come off too much so that way, but we talked about the ways in which so much television gets the South wrong. So much leans into stereotypes. So much depends upon myth. So much shows up with an agenda instead of just turning the cameras on the South and letting Southerners speak for themselves. And I'm not saying we've gotten it right. I'm saying that seeing so many people get it wrong was part of the driver for us. Like, might we try to make a show where we try to get it right and where the emphasis is not on the host, which would be me. You don't like, we just sent out there's a press release going out soon that has 4 pictures from our season on the right-hand side and the list of the cities where we go on the left. And there's a picture of me, but you can't even tell it's me. Like, this is not a host personality-driven show. It's a South-driven show. So we talked about those ideas at Handy Andy over hamburgers, and I came back and wrote a 2-page proposal that laid it out. And if you look at the show, it's a pretty simple formula, and that was in the 2 pages. We find 2 restaurants, usually, in one community, one town. Small towns are our favorites. And then we set them in conversation, the people who patronize those restaurants, the people who claim those restaurants. We set them in conversation. And the middle act of the show is usually about some bigger idea, something we learned, something you might learn if you travel to that city yourself. But we came out of that conversation with the idea. I wrote 2 pages, and then Wright Thompson's a very good salesperson, is also being a very good writer. And Rosalind Durant, who at that point was the head of the SEC network, said yes, said, go try. She trusted us to go try this thing. It was the first, to my mind, I think, it was the first time the SEC stepped beyond the bounds of sports to recognize that, the SEC network and the SEC at its heart form a community. There is a community of belief, a community of identity that revolves around those institutions. And, Greg Sankey at the SEC saw that. Charlie Hussey at the SEC saw that. I see them every time I go in Johnny's in Homewood and Birmingham because they're in there. They get it.
It's about a lot more than sports, and I think it's credit to them that they recognize that. There was one episode that I saw. I didn't see the whole thing, but you were tasting pigtails at a place called T&T Barbecue in the Black Belt of Alabama.
Yeah.
And, this is not something that you would see in most food magazines. You wouldn't see it necessarily on ESPN either. But why, just as an example, why is it important to tell the story of those pigtails?
Because if you travel the Black Belt of Alabama, that was in the little town of York, and you actually stop at the barbecue joints in the Black Belt of Alabama, there's a lot of pigtails. Like, you see pigtails as much as you see pork shoulder. If you were going to say, here's the defining dish of the Black Belt, I'd argue it's pigtails. I don't see them elsewhere, not with that kind of density. They're everywhere. And we realized making that show, again, concentrated on 2 restaurants. And the show is about craft and art and what people do in various ways in their lives to express their creativity and their craft. And we saw it in T&T Barbecue. We saw it in the Alabama Rib Shack, which is the other barbecue place we focused on there in Gainesville, Alabama, closer to the Mississippi line. And the middle of that show is about the G's Bend quilters, women who piece together fabric, piece together casticides to make something beautiful. And what is a pigtail but a piece of the pig that's been cast aside to make something beautiful?
Yeah. Well, and those quilts are hanging in museums, and they really are magnificent. But they get arguably more attention than the pigtails do. So
pigtails need some attention.
Give me one more example of another place that you really, from the new season, that you were really excited about. And I saw you say somewhere that you felt like this was the best material that you have gotten in 7 seasons of doing the show. What's one place, just a teaser or a sneak peek into something that you did that felt really kind of special?
I mean, our footprint for the show is the SEC's footprint. So this year, the SEC has added Oklahoma and Texas to the mix. And so we went to Oklahoma. And Norman, the college town for OU, is adjacent to Oklahoma City, and we made an Oklahoma City show. And so I've been writing the script. So we go out with an outline of what we're going to film, but we don't know what's going to happen on camera. Remarkable things, beautiful things happen on camera. And we don't know what it is. So when we come home, Tim Horgan, our director and my great friend, and by the way, the ear that gets us all that good music that shows up on the show, Tim sends me like, okay, here's like the roughest of cuts. I mean, there's 6 terabytes of stuff. Like, what can we, what do we get it to? So yesterday I was watching the roughest possible cut of the show, and the most beautiful stuff. We're at the Oklahoma National Stockyards, which is in Oklahoma City. And we're walking across the catwalk. So the Oklahoma National Stockyards are open to anyone. We didn't get special access. If you drove up there in your Pinto, Sid, like, you'd be able to park in the lot, you'd walk up this thing and you walk across a catwalk, and you would be walking across all the cattle that are going to be sold on Monday morning. You'd be walking across them, you drop down, and then you're in the auction barn for the cattle. Beneath you, and this is what our cameramen capture, as sun flares sparkle, as the sun's going down or the sun's rising, because they were there from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. You see literal cowboys with cool hats, with ropes on horses herding cattle. So it's like this condensed vision of the Western South on display at the Oklahoma National Stockyards. And we spent 4 days there. We spent 4 days making sense of Oklahoma with the stockyards at its core, and going to 2 really crazy good steakhouses as a way to illustrate it. But, every time I walked up and down that catwalk with the cattle beneath me and the cowboys ranging, it's like, I shouldn't be here. But we didn't even get special access. You could do it too.
That's so cool. So cool. Well, I know there's so many more stories where that came from, and I can't wait to see it see them roll out.
Thank you, Sid.
So I got to ask you a sports question. You went to Georgia for undergrad, but then you went to Ole Miss for grad school, and you've spent 25 plus years in Oxford now. Where do your loyalties lie when it comes to football?
I have a very specific hierarchy. So I work at the University of Mississippi, and that's who I cheer for. So my next team is the University of Georgia because I almost graduated from there. And then my next team maybe is Auburn because my wife graduated from Auburn. I have some affinities to the University of South Carolina too because my cousin, who as an only child was basically my older sister, she went to school there and her husband worked there. So that's my hierarchy. And maybe, I'll stop there. I can rationalize other hierarchies, but that's my primary one.
Okay, but contractually, you're really kind of obligated to Ole Miss.
Well, it's not even contractual. Like I love this town and I love working at this university. I genuinely do. And, it's who I cheer for every single time.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of divided families and divided loyalties, and it can get complicated, down here, as we all know. You've had your son Jess on a number of the shoots, and I've seen you posting about that on Instagram. And it must be really fun for you to have your son around and kind of being a part of some of these stories together and being a part of the whole effort.
It is. It's incredibly gratifying because as a parent, you only see your child usually when they're aware that you're watching them. It's all performance. It's all, under the spotlight. On this trip, Jess was out with us for almost 2 weeks when we were filming, and he was working as a production assistant. So he was moving equipment, he was fetching coffee, he was doing the things that a production assistant does. And I got to watch him work, and I got to watch him interact with our crew without him knowing it, without me even really trying to. He was just there. And it's beautiful because it confirmed many of the things I thought about our son. He was kind, he was empathetic, he was industrious, he was intuitive. Like I watched him get things before people needed them. Not always, but he's going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, clearly, and must be a lot of fun, if nothing else, just to be able to spend all that time together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, John T., I've just got one more question for you, and I hesitate to ask this question of you because it's something that you've spent much of your career and much of your life trying to figure out. And the question is, what does it mean to you to be Southern? I'm wondering if there's a if there's a shorter version. I would tell people to maybe go and read the Potlikker Papers for the longer answer. But anyway, what does it mean to you?
Wow, man. Like, that's a hard one. What's your answer?
I don't know. Fortunately, I'm the one asking the questions, but I think it means, I think a lot of it has to do with these kinds of conversations and talking to people, and you never stop asking the question. What comes to mind when you think of this?
I mean, I think about the creative power of this place, and I'm all of that. Whether it's music or books or art, whatever it is, like I'm in awe of the power of Southerners to respond to the place that brung them up and then make art, make something beautiful, to face down adversity, to see beauty and then make a new day.
And art and food is art too, of course.
Yeah. I mean, all of that, food, painting, music, it's an expression of people and place. And I would argue that we Southerners are as good at that, expressing our place, telling the stories of whence we came, as anyone.
Well, keep telling those stories, and we'll keep listening. John T. Edge, my newly discovered cousin. Thanks for being on Biscuits and Jam.
All right. Thank you, cuz. See ya.